Our next speaker, also looking at science and the role of science and whether scientists should be guardians or enablers, what they are intended, what their ideal and optimum role is in terms of providing advice and facilitating decisions. He runs his own company, Aquanet, which is a water quality science enterprise. He was, for some time, senior scientist at the Horizons Regional Council, but since he founded Aquanet, he's been working with 15 regional, district and city councils on water management and water quality issues. Perhaps most importantly, right now, he is science leader for the Ruataniwha storage scheme and also science advisor to the Hawke's Bay Regional Council on the Tuki Plan Change number 6, with a view that may or may not vary from that we've heard from Mike Joy. Would you please welcome with enthusiasm Olivier Ausseil.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your welcome. What I have been involved over the last few years, I've been involved in a range of water quality orientated projects. But one common thread over the last 7 or 8 years has been working on the setting of water quality limits. And it's really what I wanted to discuss and sort of share today is really my reflections after the 7 or 8 years working on those processes and looking into the future, into what those processes might look like in the future and what science can actually bring to the table to actually inform that process. So, I mean, there's been a changing landscape in terms of the water quality setting process from 7 or 8 years ago when there was a big vacuum to, now there's a national policy statement, there's been the Land and Water Forum, the National Objective Forum is coming, these sort of things. But overall, when you look at the key principles, the base principles that enable us to actually define water quality limits, it's first you look at a water body and look at what values are associated with that water body. They could be recreational values, they can be ecological values, they can be use-orientated values. And once you have a handle on what those values may be, then you can define freshwater objectives, which is essentially, well, what are we going to manage this catchment for? And to a large extent, that represents the balance of the values. And once we have defined those freshwater objectives, we can then define some water quality limits, which essentially, as the National Policy Statement says, sets the amount of resource use that can happen in that catchment. So it all seems really, really simple, isn't it? It's just 3 boxes and 2 arrows there. And one may really wonder, why are we spending hours, days, years, and quite a lot of sweat and blood sometimes about this process when it's so simple? Well, I've been thinking about it a fair amount, and very, what it seems to me is that we're a bunch of different people and we all have different values. And the way we balance those values will lead us to make different decisions for our own personal decisions in terms of what objectives we want for those catchments. And if you go in this room and ask 10 people to go through this exercise, or if you go in the street and ask 10 people to go through this exercise, what chances are you're not going to get one single answer. You're probably going to get as many answers as there are individuals. And I think really in that limit setting process, what we need to do, we can't really combat the fact that people will come up with different answers and different views. And I think more we need to embrace or work within that diversity and actually look at developing different options. It's looking at different options that may lead to very different outcomes. And the idea here is develop different options and inform what those different options may be. In terms of the water quality limits, just conceptually, what we have here in the vertical axis, say the concentration or load of nutrients, nitrogen or phosphorus, for example. And in every catchment, we're going to have a natural load or a natural concentration. And, in many catchments, we have a current load or a current concentration that is above what it was naturally some time ago. And through the limit setting process, you might end up, in the same place, you might end up saying, well, we want to maintain those concentrations or those those loads to their current levels, or we might end up with, it works, to higher concentration or loads, or lower concentrations or loads, or you might even want to bring it back down to natural levels. And at this stage, I'm not presuming, which option is the better. It's just for conceptually to illustrate the endpoints where we might actually get. And so again, we might end up with those options, A, B, C, and D. Now, go back to that process and those different options, and how do we actually make a decision? How do we actually inform the decision-making process as to what those different options actually mean? Essentially, this is a planning process. So, like all good planning process, they should work. But it's important that for each one of those options, there's a risk and a benefit analysis that is done, and both from an environmental point of view. If you're going to increase the concentration or loads, what is the risk to the environment? What are the effects going to be? But likewise, if you actually reduce a concentration or a load, is that going to actually result in a benefit? And these are aspects that I can deal with. And obviously, there's also the other side, which is looking at risks and benefits to other aspects like social, cultural, economical outcomes, which I'll leave for the moment because it's not my specialty at all. And so you end up with those different options and looking for each one of those options at a risk or benefit analysis. And I very much put a parallel here as to if you walk into a shop and you look at a range of apparatus, a lawnmower or something, you're going to end up looking at what each lawnmower does. So they're all going to do different things. They're all going to be constructed differently. Some, might blow up after 2 weeks, or you might buy something that is really good. And so you make your decision based on the technical specification of that thing, what it does, but also how much it costs. I don't think we actually ever make a decision when we go in the shop without actually looking at the price tag. So the whole process here is actually trying to put technical specifications around each one of those options, and then it will also put a price tag, which economists have to deal with. And where can actually science or freshwater science actually help and inform that process? It is essentially in trying to link what's happening in a catchment, link the effects of land use with concentrations and loads in rivers, and with water quality outcomes at the end, which when we look, the actual water quality outcomes is not the nutrient concentration or load. What it is actually is what it causes in terms of effects, which can be algal or plant growth, what, it's been described before, or it can also be effects on toxicity. So we'll first have a look at the right-hand side, if you want, of that process, is how do we link concentrations and loads with water quality outcomes? And I'm not going to give you any answers there, but it's just to illustrate from a conceptual point of view the different, if you want, options or the different situations that we may be facing. One might think that if you increase your concentration or load, well, you get a straight line, a linear response. The more you increase your concentration, the more you increase your risk of effect. Well, that's nice and well, and if it was like that, it would be really simple. It would be great, actually. But what we know is that biological systems pretty much never react on a linear basis. What they are more likely to do is things like this, or things like this, or even things like this. And on the last one, it's just an illustration there. If you look at productivity, for example, if the objective for a catchment is actually to have a productive fishery, there's a point where if you have very, very, very low levels of nutrient, you're going to have very low productivity there. And there's a point to which additional nutrients will actually increase the productivity, and then there's a point where it will start decreasing it again. So we're not looking at a particularly simple situation here, and each parameter and each catchment would have different response to the same treatment, if you want. Now, let's have a look at, just grab the two of those curves here, and I'll just just conceptually put those different limits, A, B, C, and D, that was talking about on that graph. And what does that mean? Depending where we are, let's have a look first at that S-shaped curve. Well, currently we are at C, that's the current concentration or the current load. If you are on that S-shaped curve here, you're essentially at a point where allowing an increase in nutrient or nutrient concentration or load will actually result in quite an effect. And you can see there will be quite a significant effect. And conversely, if you are in that area of the curve, then reducing it from C to B will actually lead to quite a significant potential environmental benefit in terms of reducing the risk or the effect. Now, if you look at the upper curve, though, if you're actually currently sitting at C and you try and move to D, or you allow a move to D, what is the effect going to be there? Obviously, you can see straight away visually that if we accept that those curves are correct, the effect is going to be much smaller, and likewise, the benefits that you might actually get out of the benefits you might get out of trying to move from C to B, for example, might also be reasonably small. However, if we keep that curve and actually shift our, the current state actually is not towards the right as it was, but let's say we look at a completely different catchment with the same dose-response relationship, if you want. Well, here we're in a different spot in the curve where allowing an increase or a decrease of concentration or load will actually lead to an effect. And where I'm getting at with this is that first, for every parameter and every effect you might be looking at, you're going to have a different response of the system. But also each different system is actually quite different. They're going to react differently to different treatments. They are currently sitting at a different spot in terms of their current state. And there's not one right answer for all the catchments, and that analysis needs to be done on a catchment-by-catchment basis. Now, let's go back to that aspect of linking land use and water quality outcome and look at the left-hand side of the thing. When the other part of the challenge, if you want, is to try and link land use with concentrations or loads of nutrients. Well, to do that, we can look at the current land use there, and we can look at monitoring data, historical or current monitoring data. We can link the two. We can link historical land use with historical water quality, and we can do the current one. But when we're looking at options, when we're looking at different options and on a very wide range of options that may or may not occur in the future, there's only one way to go, is that we need to be able to develop some modelling tools that allow us to have that robust link between what's happening in the land and what's happening in the water. And it's actually a reasonably complex and it's a multidisciplinary exercise, which is happening more and more, but I think that's really the way we need to go more and more. Now, just to reflect a little bit on those different options, the different limits A, B, C, and D, and what it might mean in terms of the catchment, in terms of the land use. So let's say, the catchment right on the left-hand side, let's say that's the current catchment land use. And Gerard was describing what you might actually get out of best management practices or the application of some management practices out of. And if the objective is to move from C to B or C to A, for example, so aiming at a lowering of the concentration or loads, what this modelling needs to be able to tell us is how far down are we going to get. Because if the application of the best management practices are not going to get us to B, but are going to get us to, for example, to that orange line, well, that is really an important piece of information. I think the implication, what is really important here is that to be able to communicate and understand the implications of the different options that are being sought or pursued by different people, or just looking at a range of options. And I think we need to stop kidding ourselves that you can actually get to B or to A, yet you can significantly lower those things without actually rethinking the way you actually use those catchments. And there's no way you're going to get back to a natural level without actually getting back to a natural catchment. The day we move into a catchment and we start actually farming and using it, we move away from that A. And I don't think it is reasonable to actually expect that we can go back to that without having to actually rethink the way the catchment is used. And I'm not saying this is the desirable outcome. I'm not saying this is what we need to do, but I think what we need to do is all understand and be honest about the catchment implications, but also the effects implications of those different options. And that's where I see really the role of science is really taking each one of those options and putting specifications around them for then the decision makers or the community to actually make a decision. So just to wrap it up, options A, B, C, and D. So that's really where I see the role and the key challenge for science and scientists in the decision-making, in that limit-setting process. I'm not saying that science and scientists cannot play a role outside that, but when we're looking at that limit-setting process, that's really, I think, where science needs to come. And also where collectively we need to see what tools we need to develop in the future, because we are there to some extent, but there's obviously always some improvements that can be made. And the critical thing is being able for each one of those options identify very clearly, okay, if you want to get there, here's what needs to happen in the catchment, and here's the risk of effect. So it's essentially linking the land use with the concentration and loads of nutrients in that case, with the risk of effect. And that analysis needs to be done on a catchment by catchment basis. All the systems that we're looking at will react differently. They all have different natural characteristics. They have different geology, different hydrology, different and the interaction between the surface hydrology and groundwater, all these sort of things. But also the current land use and where we're currently sitting at the moment, and looking at having pragmatic solutions. That is where I see the key challenge, making that information available to all, and hopefully in a way that scientists can actually agree with each other that this is the right information, but then step away and actually let the decision-making process happen with the community and the decision makers actually doing their thing. And just to wrap it up in terms of conclusion, and obviously this is a complex and a challenging area. It's technically very complex and challenging for a scientist. We have to be able to draw in a lot of disciplines, but also I think it'd be fair to say, and I find it, that it is an area that is philosophically and personally quite challenging as well. One key message really for me is that from a technical point of view, I think one size does not fit all catchments. Different catchments will react differently to the same management regime. I think really the analysis and the solutions and the options analysis needs to be made at a catchment by catchment basis. Even when we're looking at a catchment, I don't think there's one right answer. I don't know what the right answer is, but what I think that scientists can do is say, well, it's actually be clear about the risks and the potential benefits of the different ways of doing things. And I think this is a challenge for all of us, and I'm saying really all of us, is that to try and move away from a one-option approach and try and develop different options and be clear about what the risks and the benefit balance of each one of those options. And again, going back to the key role of science, I think in there is in identifying those risks and those benefits. And one thing that we need to do more and more, and we're doing more and more, is not only identifying those risks and benefits from a qualitative point of view, say, well, there may be a risk or there may be a benefit, but it's also quantifying them. So saying, we may have a benefit that may be this large or a risk that may be that large. And I think that is really the next step in the challenge, is bringing that quantification of risks and benefits into the debate so people can actually make a decision for themselves and then the community can make a decision. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Olivier.